Hello, boys and girls, it's Miss Carol again, and I'm back. I'm back to read you another story, and this is another nonfiction. That means it's a true story, and it's called Coming to America, the story of immigration. Now, immigration is a big word that means when people come to a new country from another country. And I see on the front the Statue of Liberty, which is in New York. It says thousands and thousands of years ago, there were no people at all in the Americas. None. Then during the last great ice age, nomads, which are wandering people who just kind of wander from here to there, crossed over a land bridge from Asia to what is now Alaska. These early hunters wandered here more or less by accident because they were searching for food. So let's see. American Indians, called Native Americans, are distant relatives of the ancient hunters who arrived in North America so very long ago. They were the first immigrants to arrive in what was truly a new world. So many, many thousands of years ago, people came over that land bridge. They look like they're wearing animal furs. So that's really long ago. As many more thousands of years passed, the descendants, which means the people who were born after and after and after, like you're the descendant of your grandparents and your great-grandparents, you're the descendant. As many more thousands of years passed, the descendants of the first hunters moved north and south, around North and South America. They settled in small villages and they later built big cities. By the time Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, they say that in quotes because he didn't really discover America, millions of people already lived in the great civilizations of the Americas. So here's a civilization that was living in the Southwest, in the Pueblos. They were probably called the Pueblo Indians. And here is in Egypt. Many people lived in that area called Egypt. Oh no, this is the Inca. This is from Peru. It says, after Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean, other European explorers came in search of land and riches for their own countries. Stories about the fascinating New World spread all throughout Europe. In time, settlers followed the explorers' routes across the great ocean. So here they come. These are people from Europe. These European immigrants came to make new homes in the Americas. They came in search of a better life, one free of the troubles and hardships they had left behind. In their native countries, they often had little money and could not worship in the way they wished. The immigrants hoped for freedom and for a good fortune in their new lives. So they came for reasons of freedom. It says, by about 1700, thousands of settlers lived in the Spanish, French, and English colonies of North America. Other new Americans had arrived from the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Finland, and Wales. As the population grew, the Europeans competed with the Indians, the natives, for land and food. The natives were pushed off their land and were treated very badly, and some were even killed. Not all immigrants came to America because they wanted to. Beginning in 1619, millions of Africans were brought to the Americas against their will, and they were forced into slavery. Instead of finding freedom, these Africans lost theirs, and most never returned to their homelands in Africa, so very far away. So part of our history is very cruel to some people. We brought slaves over from Africa to work in the cotton fields of the South and to be the workers in the white man's factories and things. During the 1700s, settlers continued to come to American colonies. Scottish, Irish, and Swiss settlers came too, in search of better life, wanting to have a land of their own and enough food to fill their hungry stomachs. Their hopes for the future gave the immigrants courage to face the long and difficult sea voyage. Early sailing ships took months to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The living space was very cramped, and often there wasn't enough food or water. Stormy seas made shipboard life even more miserable. So the boat is in a storm and is going back and forth and up and down, and oh my goodness, the people are getting sick. It says the new arrivals sometimes settled near the ports where they first landed. A port city is one that's right near the edge of the country, where it's right, the ocean meets the land. So they first landed in New York or Boston or Philadelphia. Charleston, Baltimore, and New Orleans were all growing cities. As early as 1700, about 18 languages could be heard in the streets of New York. So you can see people were speaking all kinds of languages because they came from countries that spoke different languages. So, my goodness gracious, I wonder if they understood each other. It says people who came from the same country usually stayed together in the same area. They felt more at home near others who lived as they did and spoke the same language. Their new lives were very hard at first. They had little money to afford anything except the most basic necessities, which is food and clothes, and shelter, which is like a house or an apartment, someplace to live. So life was not easy. It's never been easy for immigrants. They have to learn all kinds of things, as you probably well know from your grandparents or parents. Towards the middle of the 1800s, other adventurous newcomers became part of the Westward Movement. After arriving in the United States, they traveled by boat, train, and wagon train. They headed for the new frontiers in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. Free land was offered to those who would agree to stay and farm it. Norwegians joined other hardy settlers and founded farming communities in plains like Minnesota and Wisconsin. See, I came from Minnesota too. Oh, it says soon other pioneers moved even further west, all the way to California, where the Chinese and Mexican immigrants had already settled. These early Chinese settlers helped to build the first transcontinental railroad. And when it was completed in 1869, westward travel increased. The United States had become a vast nation, spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. For more than 200 years, most immigrants had come from Northern Europe and Scandinavia. That's where my family's from. By the end of the 1800s, more modern steamships had shortened the long transatlantic voyage. People began to arrive in the United States from all over the world in greater numbers. They came from Italy and Poland and Turkey and Greece and Hungary and Serbia. Although life was hard for the new immigrants, it still was better than the perils and poverty they faced in their native countries. So immigrants continued to come to the New World, to the United States. Thousands poured into the many ports, from New York City to San Francisco every year. So my family came into the port of New York City. It says here, before 1820, no one had recorded the exact number of immigrants who had arrived. But the numbers of immigrants were growing so rapidly that some states passed their own immigration laws to keep track of all the newcomers. In 1875, the United States government began to regulate immigration. That means it said, you can't come anymore. We're getting too full and there's too many different languages and we got to stop for a minute. It wanted to know more about the people who were arriving daily on American shores. A number of years later, the government began to limit immigration by saying that people from some countries could not come to the United States at all. I wonder why. Between 1855 and 1890, Castle Garden in New York City served as a depot or a stopping place for immigration. More than 8 million people passed through the port of entry. That's where my grandparents passed, in that port of entry. A few years later, on July 1st, 1892, the United States government opened an immigration center on Ellis Island, near New York City. Officials from the island would count and question the new arrivals. They would see that those admitted were healthy and ready to become United States citizens. On the day that Ellis Island opened, the first person to step ashore was a girl named Annie Moore. She was 15 years old and from Ireland. She had traveled with her 2 brothers to join their parents who had settled in the United States 3 years earlier. So her parents, these 3 children, their parents had come to see if they could make it, and the kids, I'm imagining, probably stayed with their grandparents. As big passenger ships entered New York Harbor, the immigrants caught their first glimpse of what they hoped would be their new country. And they saw the Statue of Liberty, a welcoming and inspiring sight. The travelers were relieved that their journey was finally over, but they worried about what awaited them on Ellis Island. Inspectors from the island boarded the ships at anchor to check the passengers. Wealthy passengers traveling in first class were usually allowed to leave the ship right away. The inspectors looked for signs of disease among the others. Those who were ill sometimes had to stay aboard the ship, or they were sent to other islands to recover. Those who seemed healthy were then taken to Ellis Island. On the busiest days, so many ships arrived in New York Harbor that there were long waits just to get to Ellis Island. Sometimes the wait was so long that people had to live aboard the ship for a few extra days. But once on the island, there was more waiting. With thousands of people arriving each day, long lines were formed everywhere. So people were coming. Look at all the boats coming. First, the immigrants were given a quick examination by doctors. Those with health problems were marked with colored chalk. The doctors would examine these people more closely. So they said, you go over there, we need another doctor to check you. You're okay, you go over there. The doctors would examine these persons more closely, and some people were kept on the island until they got well. After 1911, Ellis Island had its own hospital to treat those who came sick. Sometimes immigrants had permanent health problems that would make it hard for them to work. That often meant that they would be sent back to their native country. But most of the new arrivals passed the inspection and moved on to the next step. So here they are. Now the immigrants were asked a long list of questions. Inspectors asked their names, where they were from, and how much money they had. Since most of the immigrants did not speak English, they needed help in understanding and answering the questions. Translators did what they could to help the inspectors and newcomers understand one another. So there are people speaking many different languages. It says, even though it was difficult, most managed somehow to answer all the questions. Mothers often spoke for children who might be too little or too scared to speak. During the busy years at Ellis Island, millions of immigrants passed through its massive halls. World War I slowed the huge flow of people into the United States. In 1921, the United States government passed more laws limiting the number of people who could enter the country. These laws were unfair and were later changed. Other laws were passed requiring new immigrants to have medical examinations before boarding ships in foreign ports. Instead of examining them on this end, they had to be well on the foreign shore before they could even get on the boat. As a result, Ellis Island was no longer very busy, and finally, in 1954, it was closed. In 1990, Ellis Island was reopened as a museum. Today, most immigrants no longer arrive by ship. Instead, they fly into the many international airports in the United States. So now immigrants come by airplane. All newcomers to America had a hard time at first. This is true whether they came in the 1600s or even if they've just arrived. It isn't easy to start a new life in an unfamiliar place. Most immigrants have to learn the new language and new ways of life. The jobs they must take are often very hard and have long hours. Sadly, new arrivals are often poorly treated by other Americans just because they look and act differently or don't speak the language. Oh dear. Many people who came to the United States are refugees. These people are forced to leave their homelands to escape persecution or war or even natural disasters like earthquakes or fires or floods. From its beginning, the United States has taken in countless refugees from countries all over the world. So an immigrant is someone who comes to the country freely of their own will, and a refugee is usually running away from war. It says, America has been called, I'll show you this picture. America has been called a great melting pot where many cultures and many ways of lives have blended together. But today, Americans have also learned to celebrate their differences. There is a growing appreciation and understanding of the special character and unique contributions of each culture or each ethnic group. Everyone from the first Americans thousands of years ago to those who came only yesterday has left a lasting mark on the land. Immigrants settled and farmed the land because it was a country. Before it was a country. Let me start again. Immigrants settled and farmed this land before it was a country. Others created a new nation and founded its government. Immigrants built the cities, the roads, the railways of America. They have worked hard in its fields, in its factories, in its mills. Immigrants, too, have made the music of this land. They've written books and recorded its beauty in paintings. The spirit of American strength and independence is the spirit of its people, and the spirit of its immigrants and their children are the spirit of America. Oh. So it's because of all the mixtures of people that we have here that we've learned how to live together in peace, no matter what country or culture we come from. So this is the story of immigration and coming to America. I hope you enjoyed it, boys and girls. I found it quite fascinating.